March 21, 1974. A truly historic day in Pyongyang. The delegates of the Supreme People's Assembly were well dressed in their finest, Juche-inspired suits to unanimously pass a masterpiece of socialist legislation to fulfill the centuries-old desire of the global proletariat. With love and pride, Kim Il-sung declared to the world that North Korea had permanently, completely, and irrevocably abolished all direct taxation. He claimed that taxes were a vestige of the old society, a brutal tool used by capitalist fat cats to leech off the blood, sweat, and tears of the working class. To cement this glorious achievement, they circled April 1st on the calendar and officially designated it Tax Abolition Day, an annual national holiday dedicated to celebrating their tax-free utopia, while actively pitying the poor, exploited citizens of the West who still annually report to the taxman. Well, the holiday fell on April Fool's Day, and it did fool some fools. Comrades, let me ask you something. When the government owns 100% of the factories, dictates 100% of the national wages, and operates 100% of the retail stores, what's the purpose of having a tax system? The Kim regime did not eliminate taxes out of pure, unadulterated socialist benevolence. They just realized something incredibly clever about absolute totalitarian control. Collecting taxes is by no means an easy effort. Instead of hiring 1 million bureaucrats for the nightmare of tax audit, you just set a fixed wage, systematically underpay the whole population for their labor, overcharge for their state-rationed rice, and proudly announce that you ended all economic exploitations by abolishing taxation. It is the ultimate macroeconomic sleight of hand. In this episode, we examine how the world's supposedly only tax-free socialist paradise engineered the most ruthlessly extortionate economic system on the planet. We will look at the history of socialist taxation and what Kim Il-sung learned from the Soviet Union and Maoist China. Then, there was the dramatic 1974 April Fool's decree that the Kimdom eliminated taxation in its constitution. Finally, we try to understand how the Kim regime survived the 90s economic collapse by extorting non-tax taxation from its subjects. Before we dive deep into the socialist tax haven, it is time for our weekly gratitude, a massive, heartfelt salute to our channel members and patrons. You are the sole financiers of our tiny studio. We don't rely on hidden taxes or predatory state-run monopolies to keep production going. It all depends on your voluntary support. Thank you. And if you're new here, please subscribe to us for more Juche absurdity. Now, buckle up and let's dig in.
Continuously improving the people's standard of material and economic life is the supreme principle of the activities of the Workers' Party of Korea and the state. Ordinary people are provided with palatial dwelling houses free of charge. This is an advantage of the DPRK's socialism that capitalism can neither imitate nor imagine.
As the old saying goes, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain, except death and taxes. The American founding father Benjamin Franklin famously made this claim back in 1789, and it has served as a universal maxim, a foundational, inescapable truth of human civilization for nearly 2 centuries. But sadly, yet clearly, old Ben never had the privilege of living under the loving, omnipotent embrace of the North Korean founding father, Kim Il-sung. If you listen to the DPRK state media, they have actually achieved the impossible. While the Paektu bloodline hasn't quite figured out how to conquer biological death, they claim to have successfully eradicated taxes. Since 1974, North Korea has officially presented itself to the globe as the world's only socialist tax haven, a utopia where the greedy hand of the state never reaches into the pockets of the honest, hard-working proletariat. Economically speaking, it is unthinkable. Looking through archaeological records, taxation is essentially the origin story of human civilization. The moment human beings stopped wandering around as nomadic hunter-gatherers and settled down to plant wheat, somebody with a sharper spear realized they could demand a cut of that wheat in exchange for protection. The ancient world institutionalized this extortion by creating the corvée system. No fiat currency? No problem, you paid in grain. No grains? Sorry, you had to serve some physical labor. That is literally how the Great Wall of China and the Great Pyramids of Giza were built. The Roman Empire went even further, privatizing its extortion with publicani. Independent contractors bid for the right to collect taxes in certain provinces, squeezing the local farmers for every denarius they had. People hated taxation, but it was the engine of all ancient empires. Fast forward to the modern age, and Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau reframed the concept of taxation through the lens of the social contract. Tax essentially became a civic subscription fee. You want the state to cover at least a portion of your housing, education, and healthcare? You must surrender a portion of your private wealth to the collective. Taxation was rebranded as a system of social justice and wealth redistribution, utilized to provide public goods that the free market cannot easily supply, like paved roads, fire departments, a legal system to enforce contracts, basic social welfare for the impoverished, and a military to deter foreign invasions. If there is a government, whether big or small, there will be taxation. Taxes are the financial bridge between private property and public revenue. Simple. Nonetheless, Comrade Karl Marx saw things quite differently. In classical Marxist theory, the modern tax system is fundamentally viewed as a tool of bourgeois oppression. Think about 19th century Europe, like Victorian-era England. To a Marxist, the government was simply a management committee operating on behalf of the ruling class. Taxes were extracted from the blood and sweat of the working class, merely to fund the police and military apparatuses designed to beat striking workers and keep the proletariat obediently in their place. If a vanguard revolution brings us to a stateless, classless society, taxation would naturally cease to exist. If the people own the means of production, and wealth is justly distributed, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, there is absolutely no need for a tax collector. But as always, there is a massive gap between Marxist theory and eco-political reality. Running a centralized communist party, rapidly industrializing a nation, and fighting off Western imperialists requires a tremendous amount of capital. Somebody, eventually, has to foot the bill. Following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Soviets initially experimented with abolishing monetary currency and taxation entirely during the era of war communism. The government printed money recklessly, intentionally destroying the value of the ruble in an attempt to make currency completely useless. The strategy worked a little too well. The value of the ruble went through a hyperinflationary spiral of over 10,000% in a span of just 5 years. State-owned enterprises were instructed to exchange goods and materials with one another without using ruble bills. The wages of laborers were paid not in cash or credit, but in physical items like bread rations and tram tickets. The result? Industrial production ground to a screeching halt, plummeting to just 20% of its pre-war levels. Because peasants couldn't sell grain for profit, most of them simply stopped producing any surplus food, a systemic failure that culminated in the horrific Russian famine of 1921. The state rationing system could not provide enough survival food. Driven by desperation, black markets exploded, run by bagmen who smuggled goods from the countryside into the cities. At times, the black market supplied up to 60% of the food consumed by starving city dwellers. It was a total disaster and a very hard lesson for Comrade Lenin. Realizing that his regime was on the verge of collapse, he panicked and introduced the new economic policy, which reintroduced a stable currency, reinstated formalized taxation, and temporarily allowed for private enterprise and market trade. When Comrade Stalin took the throne, he didn't do much better. To fund his incredibly ambitious first five-year plan, the Soviet Union introduced the turnover tax. Because the state owned all the factories and operated all the retail stores, they could arbitrarily dictate prices. Cheap consumer goods, food and alcohol, especially vodka, were sold at significantly higher, state-fixed retail prices. If a pair of boots costs 10 rubles to manufacture, the state would sell it to the citizen for 40 rubles. The 30-ruble difference was quietly, invisibly swept directly into the state treasury. It was a regressive sales tax hidden within the supply chain. Some scholars estimate that the vodka tax alone accounted for roughly 13% of all Soviet state revenues. So, the Soviets didn't abolish taxation, they just rebranded it under the socialist flag. Maoist China, in contrast, took a slightly different path. Because the new China was overwhelmingly agrarian, the Communist Party couldn't simply extract all its wealth from urban factories. The wealth was in the dirt. To fund its industrialization, the Communist Party invented something called agri-industrial price scissors. Well, it's a Soviet economic theory describing an artificial, state-engineered economic imbalance. The government deliberately depresses the purchasing prices of agricultural goods, while simultaneously inflating the retail prices of industrial goods. If you graph these two price trends over time, they diverge sharply, resembling the opening blades of a pair of scissors. In essence, China imposed a heavy agricultural tax for industrial investment. The communist government instituted the Unified Purchase and Sale policy in the 1950s. The state created a monopsony by becoming the only legal buyer of agricultural products. Chinese peasants were forced to hand over fixed, massive quotas of grain and cotton to the state at artificially low, government-guided prices. It was a direct, systemic wealth transfer from the impoverished rural peasantry to fund urban heavy industrialization. The state bought grain for pennies, supplied it to urban factory workers to keep labor costs low, and sold industrial goods back to the farmers at a premium. This agricultural scissor was viewed as a necessary evil during the transition phase of socialism. It wasn't until the early 21st century that, recognizing the need to reduce the crushing burden on farmers, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao abolished this agricultural tax, which directly alleviated an estimated 160 billion yuan in tax burdens from the rural population. Both the Soviet Union and Maoist China ultimately recognized that extracting wealth from a certain population was the only mathematical way to build a socialist state. They used turnover taxes and price scissors, but for the most part, they acknowledged the extraction, even if they justified it with Marxist terminology. But North Korea? North Korea looked at the turnover tax and decided, we could do it better. Instead of admitting that state building requires revenue, the Kim regime realized that if you achieve total, absolute totalitarian control over the economy, you can just do the magic trick of abolishing taxation altogether. And that brings us to the theatrical masterpiece of Pyongyang in the spring of 1974.
In the DPRK, the rights to economic activities and economic life are fully guaranteed for the people. All the citizens who have reached the age for labor are entitled to choose their jobs according to their wishes and skills, irrespective of sex, nationality, and social affiliation, and they are provided with stable jobs and working conditions according to the socialist labor law of the DPRK.
It was the mid-1970s, the absolute pinnacle of the Cold War confrontation. The Republic of Korea in the south was a poor country ready to take off under Park Chung-hee's dictatorship. Up north, Kim Il-sung felt incredibly confident. The abolition of taxation was indeed significant. Before the reform, during the first 3 decades of the Kim's rule, North Korea operated a highly visible, deeply brutal, and ruthlessly efficient tax system. In 1945, the Soviet-led transitional government installed Kim Il-sung after the liberation of Korea, and the whole peninsula was a backward agrarian society just like China. There were no massive state-owned industrial conglomerates for the state's revenue. To build the new Korea, Comrade Kim followed the footsteps of Chairman Mao and squeezed the farmers. In March 1946, the Provisional People's Committee of North Korea pushed through a massive, sweeping land reform program. They abolished the centuries-old landlord-tenant system, confiscated large estates, and redistributed the land to the peasant farmers. For a brief, shining moment, the tenant farmers became freeholders. By the late 1950s, private farming was effectively extinct, and most people lived in massive state-run agricultural cooperatives. But remember, whatever the state gives, the state takes away. Immediately following this land reform, the regime introduced the agricultural tax in kind. According to official DPRK statistics, this very tax was set at a supposedly reasonable 25% of a farmer's total grain output, and the tax rate was reduced to 20.1% in 1955, then slashed to 8.4% in 1959, and completely abolished in 1966. The propagandist proudly announced that it was a massive relief compared to the predatory rate set by the Japanese imperialists. However, if we examine the real data from the declassified Soviet archives, the Workers' Party men were probably worse than the Japanese colonialists. Private letters and transcripts between Soviet officials and North Korean bureaucrats reveal that the Kim regime was chronically missing its revenue targets. To make up the difference, local cadres simply ignored the 25% legal limit. Soviet records show that the state frequently confiscated upwards of 50% of a farmer's total harvest. And if a farmer failed to produce their quota, there was no auditing service, nor any leniency. The collectors turned into thugs, beating or arresting petty farmers for the last bit of hope. It was unadulterated extortion at the barrel of a gun, justified under the guise of socialist state building. In the 60s, the tax in kind was indeed lowered, but it was because North Korea followed the Chinese model and taking 100% of the harvest at artificially suppressed state prices and returned a fraction of it to the farmers via the public distribution system. The state didn't eliminate the agricultural tax, but it eliminated the farmers' fundamental right to own anything they sowed. While the rural peasantry was being squeezed dry through the state rationing system, the cities still had a formalized tax structure. Before that wage ever hit a worker's pocket, the state extracted a direct income tax. The official tax brackets fluctuated during this post-war construction era, and it was basically a standard withholding tax, as we have in the capitalist world. Besides, workers also needed to pay a local autonomy tax to the local municipality. This generated revenue for the local government to fund city infrastructure, schools, and neighborhood management. If we look at the macroeconomic balance sheet, the 1974 tax abolishment made perfect sense. Between the years 1961 and 1970, direct taxes, which means the income tax and the local autonomy tax combined, accounted for an average of 1.9% of total state revenue. Less than 2% of the regime's entire revenue came from direct taxation on the citizens. The state had successfully nationalized every single factory and store. So the overwhelming 98.1% of state revenue came from massive turnover sales taxes placed on price-fixed goods and the profits of national enterprises. In this case, direct taxation had become bureaucratically obsolete. Realizing this, Kim Il-sung decided to cash in that 1.9% deficit for the ultimate political PR stunt. On March 21, 1974, the delegates of the Supreme People's Assembly gathered in Pyongyang. Amidst thunderous, mathematically synchronized applause, the Workers' Party passed the Law on the Complete Abolition of the Tax System. In the opening statement, the great leader declared, "It is the noble revolutionary duty of communists and a fundamental principle which the working class party and state must adhere to in the revolution and construction to free the people from every kind of exploitation and oppression. The tax system, a vestige of the old society, shall be abolished completely." 1974 was the absolute zenith of North Korean economic confidence. Thanks to heavy Soviet subsidies, North Koreans believed they were marching into the developed world. This law was meant to prove the inherent superiority of the Juche system to the entire global socialist bloc. State media went into overdrive, proclaiming that with this new law, the people's dream to live in a tax-free society has come true, and ours has become the first tax-free country in the world. They even printed propaganda posters depicting muscular, joyful workers pitying the exploited, tax-paying citizens of the capitalist West. To celebrate this grand illusion, Article 33 of their new socialist constitution proudly stated, "The state shall completely abolish taxation." The decree was made legally binding and officially effective on April 1, 1974. Yes, April 1st. I can never write a better joke than a totalitarian dictatorship legally abolishing taxes on April Fool's Day. It was like a utopian manifesto. The state officially told its citizens that because the glorious Juche revolution was complete and successful, the government was now wealthy enough to provide housing, food, and education to everyone entirely for free, without ever asking the workers for a single penny in return. But if we look at the cold, hard economic data and listen to the scholars of command economies, North Korea didn't abolish taxes, they just abolished the citizens' right to own anything worth taxing.
Women are favored with 150-day maternity leave, and many kindergartens and nurseries are provided for their children. So they're performing feats to be innovators and labor heroines.
Comrades, let's pause for a second and think it together. How exactly does a government legally abolish all taxes without instantly going bankrupt? How on earth do you fund a million-man military, cast towering bronze statues of the supreme leader, and kickstart a nuclear weapons program using nothing but socialist dreams, Juche solidarity, and revolutionary passion? The answer is to redefine taxation. To understand this 1974 economic magic trick, we have to grasp the fundamental difference between de jure taxation and de facto extortion. In a functioning capitalist democracy, Taxation is explicitly, transparently annoying. You earn a paycheck, that money legally becomes your private property, and then the government legally forces you to hand over 20 or 30% of it to fund the state. There are rules, cuts, and tiers, and on the paycheck you see the tax. You know exactly how much the government has taken from you, and you feel the pain. In contrast, the Kim regime proudly abolished de jure direct income taxes because its government had become an absolute monopsony, meaning the government was the only legal employer in the entire country. So, calculating and listing your income tax on your payslip was just a bureaucratic inconvenience. When the state is both your only boss and your only grocery store, taxmen become redundant. Most scholars and economists agreed that North Korea's command economy established two mechanisms to generate revenue, funding both the nuclear program and the Kim family's lavish, Hennessy-soaked lifestyle. The first mechanism is the national enterprise profit, 국가기업이익금. Since every single factory and workplace belonged to the state, 100% of the profit generated through national enterprises was transferred directly into the central government's bank accounts. But the question is, the global market fluctuates and oil prices go up and down, so how could the state guarantee massive profits across every single industry? Hey, don't worry. The state-owned companies can artificially suppress the cost of labor to almost zero. The regime systematically underpaid the North Korean proletariat for their labor. If a worker used his precious time to produce $100 worth of value in a state-run shoe factory in Pyongyang, the state didn't pay them a fair $100 wage and then sent a tax collector to the factory to legally demand $30 back. That would be the income tax of the capitalist world. Instead, the state simply paid the worker a nominal, practically worthless wage of $2. The remaining 98 was instantly swept into the central treasury and officially classified on the government's balance sheet as national enterprise profit. What should I say? It is an atrocious subversion of the Marxist economic theory. As a core critique of capitalism, Karl Marx argued that if a factory worker builds a chair that sells for $100, but is only paid a salary of $10, the capitalist owner has essentially stolen $90 of surplus value. This is the classic labor theory of value, and the state must seize the means of production to fairly pay the workers the total value they produced. In North Korea, everything is nationalized, and no capitalist owners can extract any surplus value. But this time, the state became the ultimate socialist owner who stole 100% of the surplus value itself. To make things worse, in socialist Korea, you cannot choose your employer. Restaurants, coal mines, textile mills, or steel plants, the state would assign you to a certain role, and there's no job market. No job market, no open competition, no job offers to compare. Irrespective of where you work, the state squeezes massive profit from you. How about the labor union? Will the union collectively bargain with the state enterprise for workers' benefits? In the capitalist world, a labor union exists as a defensive mechanism, a collective shield for workers to leverage their numbers against the capitalist class to demand a fairer share of the surplus value they create. In the Kingdom, however, the union is a whip for the state. The main duties of Juche labor unions are organizing political indoctrination sessions and asking workers to obediently increase production output. The tax wasn't taken out of your wallet. It was the massive chunk of your labor value that was legally intercepted before it ever reached your wallet. Workers were taxed at the point of production, and there's nothing you can do about it, period. According to estimates by the Bank of Korea, I mean the southern one, this direct expropriation from state enterprises accounted for 50% to 60% of the entire national budget. But stealing your labor value was only the first half of the grift. That number on the paycheck is pathetic, but workers still depend on it to survive. And that brings us to the second mechanism of transaction revenue, koresuipgum. For decades, the country's public distribution system was the only legal way for an urban citizen to acquire food, clothing, cooking oil, and basic daily necessities. Does it ring a bell? Yes, it is a complete monopoly. Just like the Soviets did with the turnover tax, state-owned grocery stores can acquire things cheaply and set ridiculous retail prices. The cycle began in the countryside. Well, the leader abolished the agricultural tax in kind, but the state still acquired grain, corn, and raw materials from collective farms at incredibly low, state-mandated quota prices. According to our dear scholar Andrei Lankov, the state purchasing prices were often set below the actual cost of production. The farmers were essentially paying the state for the privilege of staying starved, surrendering their crops for practically zero economic compensation. Then, the regime would load that virtually free grain onto trains, ship it to the industrial urban centers, and distribute it to the factory workers via the distribution network, with an invisible markup. The mathematical difference between the rock-bottom cost of acquiring products and the state-inflated retail price charged to the urban proletariat was officially classified on the regime's balance sheets as transaction revenue, which generated about 40% of the national budget. It was, effectively, a colossal sales tax profited from human needs of survival. The regime could finally look a coal miner in the eye on April Fool's Day and say, "Congratulations, comrade, you pay zero income tax," while simultaneously charging him a 400% state markup on a bag of rationed corn and diluted soy sauce. And because black markets were criminalized, you had absolutely no choice but to pay the state's ransom just to keep your family alive. By legally deleting the word tax from the national vocabulary and the constitution, the great leader successfully obscured the fact that the entire nation had been turned into a monolithic slave labor camp. And honestly, comrade, this system worked beautifully for the regime, at least for a few decades. The invisible tax machine hummed along seamlessly, funded a million-man army, and imported infinite Hennessy without a hitch. But this grand economic illusion relied entirely on external subsidies. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union completely collapsed in 1991, cheap oil and free fertilizers vanished overnight. The North Korean industrial economy ground to a screeching, catastrophic halt. The Kim regime suddenly faced an existential math problem. There was no national enterprise profit when the factories had no electricity, and the workers were too starved to work. The public distribution system had completely run out of food, and there's no transaction revenue anymore. The state went completely broke, and the regime had to pivot, adapt, and invent entirely new, brutally violent ways to generate revenue from a dying population.
As the right to labor is fully provided, labor is regarded as being noble and honorable, and the working people work with voluntary enthusiasm and creativity for the prosperity of the country, the people's welfare, and their own happiness.
When the state rationing system broke down, North Koreans did something incredible. To survive, they reinvented capitalism from scratch. Desperate citizens began trading household items, foraging for food, and smuggling goods across the porous Chinese border. These illegal, grassroots black markets became known as the Jangmadang. At first, the regime was terrified. State police conducted brutal crackdowns, burning stalls and throwing merchants into gulags. But eventually, the local party cadres, who were also starving because of the salary cut-off, had an ideological epiphany. If you can't beat the capitalists, tax them. Nobody was buying from the state-owned empty supply stores anymore, so the turnover tax had diminished to zero. Where were the real trade and transactions? Bingo, the black market. The Jiangmadang was the only part of the economy that was actually generating wealth. Officials quietly legalized the markets, designated specific areas for them, and started charging a stall fee. Anyone who wanted to sell smuggled Chinese flashlights or homegrown potatoes had to pay a daily fixed cash fee to the market management office for a space in the market. The state didn't call it sales tax. It was a kind of socialist usage fee. This fee fluctuates based on the exact geographic location of the stall and the value of the goods being sold. A vendor selling manufactured clothing or meat pays a significantly higher daily rate than an elderly woman selling tofu or cabbage to the poor. It is a mafia-style extortion. The Daily NK estimates that the regime generates upwards of 50 to 70 million US dollars in cash revenue from the country's hundreds of black markets every single year. The tax-free socialist utopia had transformed itself into the most aggressive commercial landlord on the peninsula. The central government even gives specific quotas to each district. Local managers must collect the stall fees and send the required amount directly to the national treasury in Pyongyang. This money is used to fund the military and subsidize the supreme leader's dinner table via Room 39. The leftovers are kept by the municipal government as the de facto local tax revenue. It literally keeps the lights on in government buildings, buys gas for police vehicles, and funds local infrastructure projects if there are any. Seeing through this perspective, the black market stall fee is just a type of socialist sales tax. The drawback is that extorting desperate grandmothers in the local markets only yields North Korean won, a currency practically worthless in the international market. If the supreme leader wants to buy a fleet of armored Mercedes-Benz sedans, import thousands of bottles of French cognac, or purchase specialized aluminium tubes for his uranium enrichment centrifuges, he cannot pay the Russians or the Chinese in Korean won. The regime desperately needs hard, internationally recognized fiat, such as US dollars. Desperate times, desperate measures. The kingdom must deal with foreign investors and profit from them. Starting in the late 1990s, the regime opened designated special economic zones to attract foreign capital. They carved out the Razon Special Economic Zone near the Russian and Chinese borders, and most famously, the Kaesong Industrial Complex, located just north of the DMZ, built in direct partnership with South Korea. But to attract international corporations, you need legal frameworks to protect foreign ownership. So, the regime that proudly celebrated the 1974 permanent taxation abolishment wrote some explicit, very capitalist corporate tax codes. Under the North Korean Foreign Enterprise Tax Law, foreign companies operating in these zones were subject to a corporate enterprise tax hovering around 10% to 14%. Ironically, this made the world's most reclusive communist dictatorship one of the most competitive corporate tax havens on the planet. It sounds like a relatively small cut for a totalitarian state, but the corporate tax rate was never the real grift. The real trick was the labor exploitation. During the heydays of the Kaesong Industrial Complex around 2013, South Korean manufacturing companies employed roughly 50,000 North Korean laborers to make shoes, watches, and clothing. Those firms from the fake Korea provided good capitalist wages, roughly 130 to 150 per month per worker, paid in crisp US dollars. Now, ask yourself, Were those North Korean factory workers allowed to keep their hard-earned money? Absolutely not. The South Korean companies were legally required to pay directly into a North Korean state-controlled bank. The Kim regime intercepted the dollars right at the source, pocketed the hard currency, and then paid the actual factory workers in heavily devalued, hyperinflated North Korean won. The state stole 45% to 60% of the workers' wages. To maintain the illusion of the 1974 tax-free constitution, they officially called it socio-cultural insurance fees. But let's be honest, it was just income tax. The South Korean government estimated that before Kaesong was shut down in 2016, Pyongyang was extracting hundreds of millions of dollars in pure, untaxed US cash directly from the labor of its citizens, funneling it straight into the supreme leader's personal slush fund. Yet, as dark and cynical as the Kaesong wage theft was, it was fundamentally uncreative in the world of the socialist economy. The Pyongyang central government is functionally bankrupt, and it quietly stopped providing basic operating budgets to local municipalities, rural schools, and provincial hospitals decades ago. The state abandoned its people. However, Pyongyang still ruthlessly demands that these local institutions meet impossibly high production quotas and revenues submitted to the central bank. To bridge this impossible financial gap, local officials created a decentralized, nationwide system of grassroots extortion known as sewobudam, which directly translates to non-tax burdens. Whoever invented this term must be a linguistic genius, since the Constitution says that taxes are illegal. Therefore, when a government official violently kicks in your door and demands you hand over your personal property to fund the state, they say it is your irrefutable, voluntary, patriotic duty. It is not a deduction on a digital ledger, but a physical confiscation of survival goods. Schools force young children to meet strict monthly quotas for collecting scrap metal, discarded copper wire, or rabbit skins. The school then takes these materials and sells them on the black market just to pay the teachers' salaries. If a starving family cannot forage enough scrap metal for their child's quota, they are forced to pay a cash penalty directly to the teacher to make up the difference. Meanwhile, the Inminbangjang, the neighborhood watch leaders who monitor every apartment building and village in the country, are essentially mob leaders. They routinely knock on your doors, demanding voluntary cash donations to help fund the regional military garrison, build a new monument to the Kim family, or purchase cleaning supplies to polish the mandatory portraits of the Kims in every living room. If you refuse, it means you're not patriotic, and by extension, being unpatriotic equals being a traitor. The absolute, undeniable peak of totalitarian absurdity, the policy that truly separates North Korea from every other dictatorship in human history, is the feces quota. Because North Korea is locked out of the global supply chain and lacks the industrial capacity to produce basic chemical fertilizers, they rely almost entirely on night soil, aka human and animal waste, to fertilize cooperative farms before the spring planting season. Every January, the regime launches the agricultural battle, issuing a nationwide biological mandate. Every single citizen, from elderly factory workers to primary school children, is issued a literal quota of dried feces they must collect, process, and deliver to the state agricultural authorities. These quotas are aggressively, terrifyingly high, often demanding hundreds of kilograms and sometimes over a ton of human waste per household. Let that sink in. And the ultimate punchline to this nightmare? Because the human body can only biologically produce a few hundred grams of waste per day, and the state-mandated quotas are mathematically impossible for a single family to meet naturally, a thriving, cutthroat black market for human feces emerges in North Korea every winter. If you do not produce enough waste to meet your shitty quota, you face severe political punishment. So, you have to go to the Jangmadang and use your hard-earned, desperately needed food money to buy someone else's physical excrement, just so you can hand it over to the state authorities and avoid being sent to a labor camp. It is the ultimate distillation of the Kim regime's economic philosophy. They will violently extract the surplus value of your labor at the factory, arbitrarily inflate the price of your food at the supply stores, demand a massive cut of your petty black market trades, and force your children to scavenge for scrap metal. And even if you have absolutely nothing left, you are alive, and you still have your own excrement to fulfill your patriotic duty. But don't worry, comrade. Just keep calm and smile. Go read your constitution. At least it says that you don't pay taxes. For over half a century, the Kim dynasty successfully gaslit an entire nation into believing they were living in a socialist, tax-free utopia. They built a machine that swallowed the labor of millions and demanded their literal excrement in return, all while forcing everyone to celebrate their own exploitation every April 1st. This brings us to the ultimate irony of this tax abolishment. In 2026, the delegates of the Supreme People's Assembly gathered once again in Pyongyang, but this time, Kim Jong-un quietly scrubbed the tax-free clause from the Constitution. Article 33, the glorious foundational bedrock of Kim Il-sung's macroeconomic magic trick, was covertly deleted from the nation's legal books forever. The massive nationwide scam had finally hit its mathematical ceiling. The state-owned factories are rusting husks. The public distribution system is a ghost of the past. The regime cannot extract enough national enterprise profit or transaction revenue from an economy that organically went into capitalist black markets decades ago. The Jangmadang is no longer the shadow economy, but the economy. By deleting the tax-free clause, Kim Jong-un is tacitly surrendering to the capitalists he once threw in the gulags. The regime realized that relying on chaotic, mafia-like shakedowns and non-tax burdens, like the stall fees and feces quotas, is no longer enough to fund the country's nuclear ambitions. The geopolitical game is heating up, and to survive the coming decades, the state must re-establish a formal, institutionalized tax system. The ruling cadres are desperately scrambling to build a legitimate, highly visible tax bureaucracy to directly tap into the wealth of the new merchant class. It is the darkest, most profound irony imaginable. To save his totalitarian throne, Kim Jong-un was forced to resurrect the very vestige of the old society that his grandfather swore to destroy. The state has finally dropped the socialist facade and admitted what it has always been, a ruthless, extractive enterprise that views its citizens not as revolutionaries, but as highly squeezable assets. The grand lie is officially dead. The tax-free paradise has burned to ash. Old Ben Franklin was right all along. Even in the darkest, most hermetically sealed dictatorship on earth, the taxman eventually comes.